Welcome to my new studio. I've finally moved in. You can see it behind me. It's a lot bigger than this, so I will make a video just for that. All I can tell you right now is that finally I can be more consistent. I can work in a great place. I'm super happy. But anyways, this video is about something else. It's about a big mistake that I see a lot of people doing all the time. It's ruining their artwork and they might not always realize it. And what happened was that I painted two identical artworks, and one of them was a complete disappointment. That's why I actually painted another one. I used the exact same techniques, the exact same process, and I got a very, very different result. And I'm going to share why this happened, how you can easily fix it in your paintings for them to look beautiful every time. So you can actually predict that it's going to turn out pretty good. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome back to my channel. I've been teaching watercolor to thousands of students over the course of the past 4 years on Skillshare, Patreon, and also my own art school. And if you're a beginner, late beginner, or still in an intermediate stage, I am pretty sure this video is going to help. So to give you a little bit of context, in painting number one, I used Neocolor 2 by Crayon. They're watercolor crayons. And in painting number two, I used traditional watercolors. But what I used is not going to matter. You'll see it's not the point of the video, since the big mistake I'm referring to happens with all mediums, all subjects, and all styles. So let's start with the watercolor crayon painting first. I have a standard set of 10 crayons by Crayon, and I also bought some in open stock. I went for autumn colors because the project is this leaf here. And I picked this photo because of the beautiful contrast between a very dark background and the very vibrant colors in the leaf. I think it's also a perfect photo to paint from for this season, and to me it felt really inspiring. So I picked approaching colors. That's always what I do when I started painting. I picked them to look vibrant and beautiful, and I started making swatches of them, since with watercolor crayons, it's either you make a swatch and you get a smooth wash of paint, or you can color directly on paper, and then you'll probably get some streaks underneath the activated paint. And actually, the crayons work a bit like the watercolor pencils do. And I will make more videos about them in the future, because it seems that a lot of you guys would like to learn watercolor crayons. So if you're watching this, you're new to the channel, or you haven't necessarily asked for it, but you want me to make more videos, please comment crayon in the comment section below. And by the way, I was going to share this first painting with my parents, but I decided to scrap it and just share the second one. So if you want to join my Patreon, I'll add a link to it in the description. There are over 90 watercolor and watercolor pencil painting tutorials in real time and my voiceover. So once I had prepared my swatches, I started applying the colors on wet paper. I decided to do the leaves separately because I didn't want any of the purples getting onto it. That's why you see me contour the edges. I kept applying more paint while the paper was still wet to up the contrast and color vibrancy a bit more. Because the thing with watercolor and water-suitable mediums is that it easily looks bland and boring because of the addition of water to the pigment. That's why you want to add enough paint into the original swatch or mix so it doesn't come out too light. And if possible, you want to keep adding more pigment and keep painting to bring depth to your artwork. And you probably already know that watercolor and anything similar dries lighter than what it appears when it's wet. And it's the same whether you use crayons, pencils, or traditional paints. This technique of adding more pigment little by little works well because look at how beautiful the painting is looking already. We have these light areas of the initial wash that are contrasting with darker ones. It's the power of playing with the water to paint ratios, but also it's the power of layering, of overlapping more paint on top of a base. I wanted to try something out and get the highlights back in places, so I just added some splatters of water And that excess of humidity is what created these blooms. The excess water pushes the drying paints, and it's a fantastic way to add texture or to create certain effects in the painting. That's why I like to do this in the last stages of a wet phase, just because the blooms will show more when the paper is drying than if you were trying to do them when the paper is really wet. If you're familiar with watercolor, I think you can see so far how similar watercolor crayons are. That's why I was saying this video is not about the difference between both mediums, because overall, I think they're too similar to run into big problems or big differences between the two. I didn't like I added so many blooms in the background, so I wet it again after it had dried to smooth them all out and make them more discreet. And as you can see, it worked like a charm without even affecting the color elsewhere. Next, I started working on the leaf with my other colors, yellow and a pinkish shade of red. I don't really have a lot of watercolor crayons, so I went with what I had. I wish I had had a more red crayon, but I wanted to use that one at first, so that's what it is. And after that, I started working section after section. And my biggest focus there was to avoid the whitest areas from the photo to keep that contrast between light and dark tones on point. I also like my works to look smooth and realistic, and that's why I softened some edges with a clean and damp paintbrush to end up with not only just hard edges from paint drying on dry paper, but also soft edges, even though I did not pre-wet the sheet for the leaves. One thing I also always do and recommend is to overlap colors, or at the very least, try to have several colors appear in one area. Otherwise, you may end up with something cartoony. The art wouldn't look realistic if it was just one yellow part and one red part in the leaves. Because the world and everything around us is made of an infinite amount of colors, so the quickest and easiest way to render that in a painting is to work with a few different ones, and that works, just a few. And when you can, have them mixed together on paper, on wet, or just layer them on dry. To create in-between colors, not sure it's the right way to put it, but to get my point. Because that way it's not just going to be red and yellow, is also going to be red mixed to a little bit of yellow and yellow mixed to a little bit of red. And that's going to leave you with a little bit more variety in your painting. Then I included a brownish color to create some shadow because that is crucial for realism. Having midtones like yellow and red is really important. You also want to have some light tones, and here is the white of the paper. You also want some dark tones, and the dark tones here are that brown color that I was using. When the base was painted on those leaves, I added more color by just layering more paint on top. And then I included the purple that I had used in the background. And as you can see, this color really helped the shadows. But still, I was not satisfied. And even the next day, my spouse let me know that this did not look like my usual type of art. He was a little bit surprised. He said it looked unfinished. And I knew exactly what it was coming from, and that what he meant by unfinished was that it looked bland, it looked lifeless, it just did not pop. I had worked with those Neocolor too before, not these colors, the yellow and the red, but I had used my other ones in this painting here that actually looks great. As you can see, it looks very realistic and it's faithful to the original reference, so there was no surprise there. And I wasn't expecting this to happen this time around. I used all the right techniques, my usual process, and that's where I knew I had to make a video about this because you're gonna see what happens with the second painting. This time I used watercolors because I felt like it, and I knew for sure that I would end up with something that I like a lot more since I use my paints a lot. So just like I did before, I started with a light mix of paint to which I kept adding pigment as the sheet was drying. I also made sure to have several colors show in my background and to overlap some of them. And my favorite technique to overlap colors on wet in a way that looks seamless is to tap the brush on paper. It helps me get nice gradients and it helps avoid those back and forth brush strokes. And you can see how much darker this is looking now. One thing though, one problem I always run into is I often lose my natural highlights when I paint on wet. I know it happens to a lot of you guys too. And that's why here too, I was very careful with the leaf. I even added masking fluid this time around to the whitest areas. And I contoured the rest of it, just like I did before with the first painting. Again, I went for making blooms. I added water to the drying paints, and I managed to get some of the whites back. I didn't like that I added so many blooms before, so this time I added less, and that was one of the perks of doing this painting again. Still, there were things I didn't like in my background, but that's just a part of my normal process to tweak and improve some things. So when that happens, I'll just wet the background again and I'll go fix what I need to fix. So far the painting looks a little bit different just because of the colors. Of course, they're not exactly the same, but you can see that I was doing everything the same techniques. Same with the leaves. I avoided the whitest parts and I worked with two paintbrushes, section after section, to create the base. And here is where it gets super interesting because if I was to stop the painting there, it would have looked very similar to the first one, except that this was just the first layer. While in the first one, I did paint a second layer in the leaf. So here it is, one of the big mistakes that people make when they paint or even draw is that they tend to stop too early. And I know that for me, that was not the case here because it was just I was using those colors that look more like pastel colors than regular colors. And they made it really hard to make my subject pop. My second layer didn't really do much compared to the first one. And that's also proof that technique does not matter. You can do everything right. And if you're lacking in contrast, it's just not going to work. So sometimes it's just a low quality supply. Sometimes it's a pastel colors like my crayons. And I even had that happen with those pastel watercolor pencils that made it a pain to paint this flamingo and make it realistic because the colors just didn't show very much. Sometimes it can also be the paper because paper can make or break a painting. But most times, however, it's just the fact of stopping too early, of not adding enough shadows, and then you end up with just midtones. And even if you add the light tones into the mix, if there are no strong shadows to balance the contrast against those light tones, it's going to look flat. So you really need all three of them. Here, I knew exactly what I was doing with my process and my paints. I knew the base layer looked flat, that it was totally normal. So I just added my second layer and I knew it was going to transform the whole painting as it always does. And that's why I repeated the same techniques that I did before. I just layered more color on the leaf base with a clean and damp brush technique. The shadows I started adding with sepia made each part pop and detach from one another, which was exactly what I was expecting. I also increased the consistency of my paints and I made them a bit darker with sepia still. And to do that really helped me add detail and realism with a combination of various strokes, colors, and textures. I had great highlights already, and the colors and shadows came out great the second time around. But still, I decided to lift paint off the sheet to increase the highlights even more and up that contrast a bit more. And remember, this only works if there are dark areas for the whitest parts to contrast against. Sometimes I like to use white gouache when I want to highlight tiny parts in a painting, especially when it's on dark because it works really well. It's the most effective way of doing it that I've found. And when I do it, I try not to overdo the gouache. But here it really helped me redefine the edges of the leaf that I had lost when I was painting the very dark background on wet. Then I had a little problem with some gouache ruining the bottom of the painting, but I managed to remove it and layer more indigo on top, which is great news because it shows that you can fix pretty much all the mistakes in watercolor or all the things that go wrong. There's always a solution. So this painting looks a lot more like my normal artworks. And if you find yours to look unrealistic, maybe a bit flat, question the level of contrast in them and see if that's where you're missing the mark. So I hope this video has helped, and if you want to learn more of my secrets and techniques, here's the one that I recommend to watch next. Thank you for watching and see you next time.